Good morning, everybody. We are going to start with another exciting session on vaccine research and development. And it's hosted by CEPI. You'll hear more about that, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, a new partnership. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Max Planck Institute for Infection Biology here in Berlin, and also Janssen of Johnson & Johnson. And this is the second session on vaccines at the World Health Summit. Here we really will look at the whole pipeline from discovery to vaccine confidence, acceptance, and development, of course. It's no secret. Vaccines have been a major, playing a role in terms of controlling infectious diseases and are as relevant today as they were 50 years ago. Some of the easy work has been done, and we have some really major intractable problems. Think of an HIV vaccine, but also the perceptions of the value of vaccines is also evolving in society. So we have a stellar list of speakers, and the first one is going to be Richard Hatchett, who is the executive director, the CEO of CEPI, and he will talk about the specific issue of preventing future epidemics and the place of vaccines in pandemic threats, and also the challenges of developing vaccines where there is no market incentive, or the market incentive is not as strong as for others. So we'll have 4 presentations, and then all the the speakers will sit here on the front, and we'll have a conversation among ourselves and with you in the room. So Richard, please.
Thank you, Peter. And I want to thank the organizers of the World Health Summit for inviting us to participate and offering us this wonderful opportunity to present a little bit about what we're doing. I want to start, I guess there's my title slide. Want to start with an example that really is topical, but that I think illustrates some of the main points that I want to make. I think, as all of you know, we are in the midst of a plague outbreak in Madagascar. WHO is responding. The numbers have gone up quite dramatically. The previous estimate was, I believe, around 390 cases. The most recent estimate, just from a couple of days ago, the number of cases is up to 684, with 57 deaths involving 35 districts out of 110 in Madagascar, 10 cities, including the capital city, reporting cases. Antibiotics have been deployed, sufficient to treat about 5,000 people and to provide prophylaxis to 100,000, as well as financial resources from WHO's emergency fund. Non-pharmaceutical interventions have been implemented. Hopefully, this is an outbreak that will be brought under control very soon. We don't worry about plague as a pandemic threat anymore because we have effective countermeasures. Yersinia pestis is easily treated if diagnosed early. We have numbers of antibiotics that can be used to break the course of even pneumonic plague epidemics, which this one is. Go back to the 14th century, that obviously wasn't the case. Completely different world, different environment, no such thing as public health at the time. Plague, this was the second of the great plague epidemics. The first was the plague of Justinian in the 6th century. Plague in the 14th century was thought to have depopulated Europe by about a third of the population. What you can see here, this is an interesting study looking at the economic impacts of plague over time. Long-term depopulation of Europe. In some places, numbers did not recover to pre-plague population figures until 1700 or even later. It completely disrupted the feudal economy, led to long-term changes in labor relations, led to long-term changes in wages, price of grain, probably led to significant changes in European agriculture. It was a devastating event that ramified through history for hundreds of years. We have a SEPI newsletter, which I would encourage all of you to subscribe to. You can sign up on CEPI.net if you don't already. I write an editorial in the biweekly newsletter, and I chose to write actually about some of the work that Eske Willerslev and colleagues at Cambridge and Copenhagen have done to reconstruct the evolution of plague. A few years ago, in fact, it was debatable or was debated whether Yersinia pestis was actually the causative agent of plague up until 2010 in the case of the 14th century plague and 2013 in the case of the plague of Justinian. And using techniques of paleogenetics and paleoepidemiology, scientists had proved that those two plagues were both attributable to Yersinia pestis by recovering Yersinia from plague pits in widely distributed sites across Europe. Eske Willerslev and his team actually expanded that work, going back, finding evidence that plague has actually been endemic in human populations for up to 5,000 years. But he was able actually, through this work, to demonstrate the gradual accumulation of genetic factors that enhanced plague's virulence and its transmissibility. In particular, I cite a couple of the genetic loci that he identified: the emergence of the YMT gene, which is a phospholipase, encodes a phospholipase that allows plague to survive in the gut of the flea and thus to become a vector-borne disease. A point mutation in the PLA gene, which was essential for the development of bubonic plague, and the emergence of a frameshift mutation which caused flagellin not to be expressed and actually assisted plagues to evade the human immune system. And he was able to put a timestamp on these changes over the course of several thousand years. And so the fascinating thing about this is that plague coexisted with humans, probably caused human illness, but did not have pandemic potential until it accumulated these changes, and then it became this truly devastating disease that impacted the course of civilizations, both the Eastern Roman Empire and then medieval civilization in Europe. I think this hindsight is always 20/20, but I think this retrospective analysis at least provides a prospect or a hope that we will be able to predict or to learn enough about pathogens that we can predict in advance of them becoming pandemics that they present a significant risk to human populations. Whatever you think of the work that Ron Fouché and Yoshikawa Oka did a few years ago with gain-of-function research in H5N1, this is what they were trying to do prospectively, was to identify mutations that could potentially lead to H5 becoming transmissible in mammalian populations, and specifically humans, that could turn it into a pandemic pathogen, and to do so in a way that would allow us to monitor and to respond in advance of facing a pandemic. I just want to cite one other recently published paper. This came from the groups that have been funded by USAID's PREDICT program, looking at the global virome, the known virome, and looking at its distribution in terms of viral families, their potential for expression in multiple mammals, and where they are found in nature, because as all of you know, the vast majority of human diseases are zoonotic in origin. And then they were actually able to prepare risk maps identifying what they called missing zoonoses. These would be zoonoses that we would predict based on our understanding of the families, understanding of the distribution of the species that harbor them, and to help us begin to target our surveillance efforts and to tell us in which kinds of mammalian species we should be looking at for these missing zoonoses that in theory should have the potential or could have the potential to become pandemic disease. I think this is just another example, in addition to the work that I just cited, of these scientific advances potentially enabling us to be better prepared for epidemic and pandemic diseases. So CEPI was essentially created as an insurance policy or as a safeguard against future epidemic and pandemic diseases. It was launched in January of this year. We are a brand new organization at Davos, and it really represented a convergence of political will to address this enduring global health security problem, and through the pooling of resources to advance the development of vaccines and vaccine platforms to protect against epidemic diseases. Just at a very high level, our strategic objectives are to enhance preparedness against known threats, to develop what we are calling just-in-case vaccines against threats that have been identified by WHO under its R&D blueprint as urgent threats requiring the development of countermeasures. To improve response speed by supporting the development of platforms that will allow us to develop just-in-time vaccines. So if a novel threat were to emerge that we hadn't previously encountered or that we hadn't suspected, such as Zika, of having pandemic potential, if we needed to develop a vaccine very rapidly, to have capabilities and platforms that we've already developed and explored with regulatory agencies that would potentially allow us to respond much more quickly than we have been able to respond in the past. To do so in a way that addressed the business model problem for epidemic vaccines. Epidemic vaccines address diseases for which there isn't a current commercial market, and that presents a huge challenge to our private sector partners, who are the only ones who have the capability to develop and deliver vaccines, but they can't justify it economically, and that's why public-private partnerships are so important. And finally, and critically, to ensure that the vaccines that we develop are available to the populations who need them, and thus to ensure equity of access to these global public goods. So CEPI, just in a nutshell, we are a coalition, a big tent coalition, which brings together public partners, private sector partners, philanthropies, and civil society organizations. Our goal is to develop and to stimulate, finance, and coordinate the development of vaccines against epidemic threats. We occupy a particular part of the vaccine development spectrum. I'll come back to this, but essentially it's the advanced development from late preclinical. In our current first 5 years through phase 2 is our goal for the first 5 years, to develop vaccines from late preclinical through phase 2, and to deploy those vaccines into what we are calling investigational stockpiles, and to support the development of these rapid response platforms. I mentioned the WHO R&D blueprint. It is for action against epidemics. The R&D blueprint is a critical document for us because it is a document that comes from the only organization that has a truly global mandate to protect human health, representing 194 nation states. And the R&D blueprint has created a list of 11 pathogens that we need to have urgent action against. CEPI doesn't have the resources to address all 11 pathogens at the same time, so we went through a prioritization process that looked essentially at factors that could contribute to the impact of these diseases if widespread epidemics were to occur, as well as what we understand about the pathogens in terms of how to produce immunity, whether they produce natural immunity, and the current status of vaccine candidates. And by amalgamating those different dimensions, we were able, through our scientific advisory committee, to prioritize 3 pathogens, MERS, Lassa, and Nipah, as the targets of our first call for proposals. And I'll talk just a moment briefly about the work we're doing against those pathogens. We are just in the process. We have now selected the partners that we want to establish partnership agreements with, and we are entering into negotiations to do so as I speak. Lassa fever, as many of you know, is an endemic disease in West Africa, affecting, it's thought, up to 300,000 people a year. A large number of cases are asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, but among those that come to medical attention, the case fatality rate is high, and the heat map demonstrates areas of risk for Lassa fever. MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, a disease endemic in camels in the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, which has been responsible for a number of large outbreaks in the Arabian Peninsula, and which is translocated in certain individuals to other countries, particularly in Western Europe, the United States, and notably in South Korea, where a single individual led to an outbreak that ultimately led to more than 180 cases a couple of years ago. So clearly a disease like its related coronavirus SARS, with great potential for global spread. And finally, Nipah, which is a disease that causes a respiratory syndrome and an encephalomyelitis, found originally identified in peninsular Malaysia. Subsequently, most of the cases that have been observed, most of the outbreaks that have been observed in South Asia, particularly Bangladesh. It's a zoonosis from bats and often being transmitted through infected pigs into human populations, related to the virus Hendra that has caused outbreaks in horses and among veterinarians in Australia, and was actually the basis for the fictional disease in Steven Soderbergh's film Contagion several years ago, a really frightening disease, possibly a little less well known than Lassa or MERS. The diseases present different challenges. WHO has developed target product profiles for all of the diseases. We're coordinating our efforts. The target product profiles that they've developed call for a prophylactic vaccine in the case of Lassa, a vaccine for prophylaxis and preventive use in humans for MERS, and there's certainly interest in developing a camel vaccine, and for Nipah, a response vaccine. And the kinds of immunity that are what we understand about our requirements in terms of producing effective immune responses differ across the three diseases. And so there isn't a one-size-fits-all vaccine, unfortunately, given these different operational requirements, these different biological requirements. In terms of the partners that we are entering into discussions with now to establish these partnership agreements, one, they're a diverse group of partners. They represent nonprofit organizations, academia, small, mid-sized biotechs. We have some large multinational corporations that are not necessarily the prime, but that would be part of consortia to develop these vaccines. We have multiple vaccines per target that we will be developing, and fortunately and excitingly, I think, multiple platforms for each of the target pathogens. And so we're very excited about the portfolio that we'll be able to announce as these partnership agreements are signed in coming months. I mentioned that CEPI fills, as a funder, fills this important gap in advanced development from late preclinical through phase 2. We also, and I'm drawing on my experience working in the U.S. government on these programs previously, we also recognize that funding in isolation for that phase of development by itself is not going to deliver us the products that we need. We have to coordinate these efforts end to end, and we are working very closely with WHO and with other partners that own different parts of this life cycle of development to try to coordinate our incentives, coordinate our efforts. And this is a work in progress, but I think it's going to be critical to our success that we have an end-to-end global vaccine development enterprise that is well coordinated. So in summary, CEPI is a new product development partnership. We are well funded. We've received $620 million in commitments towards our goal for the first 5 years of $1 billion. Our focus is developing vaccines. We're a broad coalition, a big tent coalition. We're inviting new partners. We are seeking additional funders. We want to make that $1 billion goal. And as I said, our goals are to enhance preparedness, accelerate response, ensure market predictability, and most importantly, promote equity of access to these global social goods. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and really thanks for your leadership, because CEPI, I should say, is one of the positive spin-offs, okay, of the of the Ebola crisis in West Africa. One of the recommendations of the various panels was that we need a better mechanism for developing vaccines and therapeutics, but in this case vaccines, where there is no market incentive. And Germany, I should say, has played a major role in setting up CEPI. The first meeting that I chaired at the World Economic Forum was in January 2016 to test the waters where there was appetite, and 1 year later, as you could see, it was launched at the World Economic Forum. So that's, by any standards, is fast, although I always think it's too slow. But we'll have now soon, as Richard said, the first awards will be given for product development in these three infectious diseases. So now let's move to something that's not an emerging infectious disease, but it's tuberculosis, which has been around for centuries, just as the plague. It was interesting, where we do have a cure for 60 years or so, but it's still epidemic in many places. And we have one of the leaders in terms of vaccine development here with us, based here in Berlin, Stefan Kaufmann from the Max Planck Institute, and who will talk about his pioneering work on developing a TB vaccine, which is badly needed if we ever want to get rid of the, of this infection. So, Stefan, please, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for your interest. Can I have the first slide? Do I do that? Oops. Yep. Well, as Peter just said, that Ebola was a mind changer, really. Let me start with this slide on high-level meetings at the United Nations. As you know, they regularly hold high-level meetings on topics of major importance for the global community. Surprisingly, to me at least, only 4 of these high-level meetings dealt with health issues. In 2011, the first one on non-communicable diseases, and the 3 other ones on infectious diseases. At the height of the Ebola crisis, which Peter just mentioned, the first level on an infectious disease took place because Ebola was not only a humanitarian crisis, but also clearly a wake-up call to see that health is an issue, that health can be issues and crises can become extremely costly, and that we have to do something that is, in other words, like CEPI, we have to be prepared. Soon another health issue was considered important, and that was antimicrobial resistance, and the high-level meeting in 2016 dealt with this. Indeed, 700,000 deaths are caused by antimicrobial resistant pathogens, and this is an enormous cost of some 30 billion to 50 billion in the industrialized world only. Now, these are all issues that are newly emerging, or at least perceived as newly emerging, new diseases, new mechanisms. However, in 2016, also a meeting took place on one of the major plagues of today, and that is AIDS, a meeting on ending AIDS. The one plague I would think is still missing on that list is the #1 killer of all infectious agents, causing 10.4 million cases in 2014 and about 1.8 million deaths in 2014 as well. Even amongst the antimicrobial resistant pathogens, the #1 killer again is tuberculosis, with 110 or more people dying of MDR-TB, and that is about 15 to 20% of the 700,000 AMR deaths. So what can be done at the R&D, at the research and development front? There's no doubt that we need better diagnostics, better vaccines, and better drugs. More importantly, I think that these have all to interact with each other. I would also mention here already, and hope that we come back to this on the discussion, this should not only be the interactions between the different disciplines in a single disease, but also different interactions between the different diseases, such as vaccine development for emerging diseases and for current diseases. I will now give a very personal view on a vaccine that we developed, and it's now the most advanced live TB vaccine, because I consider it interesting that it started in a German academia, Max Planck, which is really focused on basic research, and then moved on forward to become a vaccine candidate developed in clinical trials by an Indian industry, which is the largest vaccine producer in the world, private vaccine producer in the world, according to doses produced, and that's the Serum Institute of India. I'm not going into any detail about our vaccine. Obviously, I will be happy to discuss if you have questions on that. Let me just summarize where we are in the clinical trials. A phase 1 trial in Germany had been completed already in 2009, which was then followed by a phase 1b trial in South Africa, a highly endemic area, and was also successfully completed in 2011. The vaccine was then introduced in a new population, and that is neonates. And in 2013, we completed a phase 2A trial in neonates in South Africa. A phase 2 trial is now ongoing in HIV-exposed neonates, and the data will be unblinded later this year. So we are now ready for a phase 2b efficacy trial and also for a phase 3 trial, which will start either this year in India, a phase 3 trial, or in South Africa in neonates in 2018. And that raises a major issue which I would like to bring up here, and that is how to design a phase 3 clinical trial for efficacy under limited financial resources. I think we all agree tuberculosis is a disease of poverty. And here I think research and development can again participate and contribute. We want to reduce numbers of participants, and we want to shorten trial duration to reduce cost. And I give you an example how R&D might contribute to that. Let's just assume for a vaccine trial you would need 200 TB cases, which are either prevented in the vaccine group or would develop in the control group. So even in a very high endemic area, the incidence would be less than 1 in 100. Let's just assume 1 in 100. What that means, if we would need 200 individuals, that makes 5 per 500, or we would need some 20,000 participants per group, makes some 40,000 total if you have a control group and a vaccine group only. That over 5 years would make about $200 million. That's a lot of money. It's almost unaffordable for a vaccine of for a disease of poverty. Now, one way to circumvent that came up through studies which we overtook which we performed over the last 15 years with support by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as one of the first Grand Challenge programs. What we were interested in is whether we can predict today who will develop TB disease tomorrow. We went into household contacts where about 3 individuals, healthy household contacts, would develop disease over 2 years or so. More importantly, we could identify those today who will develop disease 6 to 12 months afterwards. These we now call individuals with subclinical TB. They are healthy, but they are on their way to develop disease. Now, in this case, if we would focus on the individuals with subclinical disease, and we have about 65% specificity and sensitivity, we would argue that we only need 150 individuals for 100 individuals who will develop disease. That makes some 300 participants per group, some 600 total over 1 year, or less than $1 million. So really, here is an example where R&D not only led to the development of a vaccine candidate, but also to a measure that may reduce study participant numbers and study duration. So I think R&D can provide guidelines for significant cost reduction. And cost really plays a major role in TB research and development because that's totally underfunded. Currently, about $500 million are available for tuberculosis research in development globally, but we need at least about $2 billion. I think that this is a large amount of money, obviously, but it's also small if you compare it to the cost by TB. Just to treat all TB cases in the world, you would have to consider about $2 billion. That's the amount that we all, as a global community, request for research and development in TB. But if you add all additional costs, you easily come to $20 billion. And according to many calculations, we should rather be realistic and think of in the order of 100 or $200 billion, leading to about 0.5% lost cross-national income. So R&D for TB, I would argue, is a bargain, and that holds true, of course, for many, many other infectious diseases. So I think, in summary, it's good to realize that the United Nations indeed have seen this as a problem and will hold a high-level meeting in 2018 on the topic of how to stop TB. Let me summarize a few lessons that we learned, or I learned over the years on that. First, the more general ones. We need incentives for targeted R&D. We need to discuss at least whether we need better or different patent and license mechanisms. Advanced market commitments often comes up, and clearly a dual price system and alternative incentives. And I think it's interesting that CEPI now calls the funding of research in the issues they are interested in as awards rather than as supports. My more specific lessons learned have a lot of end. I realized that public and private partnerships only can make it in a vaccine development, very early stages covered by the academic, the more late clinical trials, and later on final licensing activities with industry. We experienced an example of an industrialized country development in the early stages with an emerging market country, namely India, working together. So borders have been broken up. I think we can learn from the emerging and the existing threats equally, so those should go together. And what I learned in India and what we will hear more about is that we need to improve further delivery and acceptance of current vaccines, and at the same time, the development of new vaccine strategies. Vaccines can learn from diagnostics, as I gave you the example of biomarkers, which of course are also interesting candidates for diagnostics. And vaccines and drugs will also learn from each other as we enter a phase of host-directed therapy. So in summary, I think I learned really to reach out to different places in the world, to cooperate with different partners in the world, and to connect with many partners as possible. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefan. You're showing that you're not only a great scientist, but also a connector in making it happen, because otherwise it won't benefit. One thing I should say, though, that the first high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly was in 2001 on AIDS, and the first one, the Security Council, which may be actually even more important, so some was in 2000 on AIDS, and then the only two have been discussed as issue was in 2014 on Ebola. And I think these are indeed game-changing events that then triggered many things, like the AIDS epidemic gave rise to global health, basically, as we know it today. And I hope that the Ebola tragedy in West Africa was also now a wake-up call for epidemic preparedness and generated, among other things, CEPI. Now we have a third perspective from industry with Alan Tennenberg, who is the Chief Medical Officer for the Janssen Global Public Health Group. So that's an internal cluster. Maybe Alan, you will explain it to us, of Johnson & Johnson paying attention to public health and global public health. There you are. So very pleased that you could join us. And J&J has invested a lot in Ebola vaccine, and so we'll hear more from Alan. Bye.
Thank you, Peter. and thank you also to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. If we could bring up the first slide. Wrong slides. There we go. Well, while those are loading up, I can still get started. There we are. Okay. So I'm going to try to create some context for you by answering a question. And that question is one that I get asked fairly frequently. And it's one that some of you may be thinking about as well. And that question is why? Why would a private sector organization, a commercial organization, a corporation be interested in developing vaccines for pandemics or be interested in developing drugs for TB or vaccines in that space when, as Richard pointed out, there's a market problem in these areas? If ultimately the goal of a corporation is to give back to shareholders and to generate profit, as many of us, I'm sure in the audience, would agree is certainly one of the primary goals of a commercial organization, how can we be successful if we spend a significant amount of time, attention, and resources working in areas where the market simply can't support the types of returns that are necessary to continue to support and feed the growth and of the organization and continued investment in R&D. So I'm going to try to answer that question for you right now. Johnson & Johnson is a large company, the largest healthcare corporation in the world, and we've been around for 130 years. Our products are sold in 175 countries all over the world, and I think most importantly, we employ over 132,000 people. Those people all have families, and those families live in communities, and those communities are affected by epidemics, they're affected by pandemics, non-communicable diseases, and natural disasters. Just to give you an example, we have several important manufacturing facilities in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico was already severely affected by Zika, and just a couple of weeks ago, parts of Puerto Rico were devastated by a major Atlantic hurricane. Our employees live in these areas and are affected by these disasters, and we absolutely feel a responsibility to those employees and their communities. We are very involved in Zika relief, and we partner with organizations like the CDC to make that happen. We're involved in hurricane relief in Puerto Rico as well, and we partner with a number of NGOs on the ground to help to make that happen. We've been involved as a company in corporate social responsibility and philanthropy literally for decades, working in workforce development and developing healthcare infrastructure in the developing world, working on training and supporting primary healthcare workers and nurses. And in 1943, our chief executive officer at the time, Robert Wood Johnson, wrote something called the Credo. And the Johnson & Johnson Credo is, in essence, a set of simple values that guide decision-making within the company and help to map out how we see our responsibilities in the world. Those responsibilities are to our customers, to employees, to communities, as well as to stockholders. And what you see on the slide currently in front of you is the Credo literally etched in stone at our corporate headquarters in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And it truly does guide the decision-making that takes place in the company day to day about how we engage globally and how we engage in our local communities. So Peter mentioned that we recently formed an organization within Johnson & Johnson called Global Public Health. And in essence, what the Global Public Health Organization is meant to do is to connect between our innovation and commercial activities on the one hand and our corporate social responsibility and philanthropic activities on the other hand, and bring the two of them together and build into our business model developing drugs, developing vaccines, developing devices that are appropriate and needed in the developing world, in poorer parts of the world, and to make sure that they're accessible and to make sure that they get there. So we've incorporated it in as part of our business model, and it's new for us. It's somewhat changed the way that we're thinking and doing things, but it's very consistent with the credo that we've been living by in the corporation since the mid-1940s. So what did the Ebola crisis teach us? And this should be no surprise to all of you here in the room, many of you who've worked on epidemics and pandemics, and anyone who's been attending this conference for the last couple of days. but it certainly underscored that there are tremendous gaps in our preparedness for these sorts of crises. And I think that when I say our preparedness, I do mean our preparedness. And as a representative here of the private sector, I'd say that we need to take responsibility as well for the level of preparedness worldwide when we have to face these sorts of outbreaks. It also underscores weaknesses in the healthcare system. When you do not invest sufficiently in primary care, when you do not invest sufficiently in healthcare infrastructure, and most importantly, when you do not invest sufficiently in healthcare workers, we see what happens when a shock hits the system, and the system literally can collapse. But also, on the bright side, we saw what can be accomplished using a multi-sector collaborative approach to response. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the response within Johnson & Johnson to the Ebola outbreak. The first thing that we did, was actually donate some money to the CDC Foundation and to some NGOs to start to immediately work on Ebola relief and to help get supplies to the area that they were needed the most. But soon thereafter, really at the same time, we invested in the acceleration of the development of our prime boost Ebola vaccine candidate. And that investment was to the tune of almost $250 million. We also redeployed some extremely talented scientists and clinicians and experts in clinical research and development to make sure that that investment, that financial investment, would go to the best possible use to make sure that this vaccine would get developed. We formed and worked within multi-sector consortia. We had many partners that we worked with. For example, the London School of Hygiene and Topical Medicine, the IMI, the NIH, BARDA. We work closely with the CDC, with the WHO, with many, many partners around the world. And we really and truly did learn how important those partnerships were. In fact, we're continuing to refresh and renew those partnerships. And just a couple of weeks ago, we announced a new partnership with BARDA to continue funding of the Ebola vaccine initiative to make sure that it ultimately becomes licensed and it's available when needed in the event of another emergency. We rapidly accelerated our clinical trials and the clinical development program. In fact, at one point, there were 11 clinical trials in various phases going on at the same time in 3 continents around the world. We also scaled up production at the same time and worked to improve vaccine stability. And even before the Ebola crisis had fully come to an end, we had 1 million complete regimens of vaccine produced and in the freezer, ready in the event that there would be another flare-up, and that we would be forced to act in partnership with public health authorities. Now, the last bullet point, I don't mean to suggest that we typically don't work in a transparent way with our stakeholders. Looking at that, it might cause you to think that, but what I'd like to underscore is that we had to work even more closely with stakeholders. I think everyone knows, so I might as well just be upfront about it. There isn't always the degree of trust that's necessary for the private sector and public sectors and civil society to work together. But I think we demonstrated during the Ebola outbreak that that trust is possible, that openness is possible, and great things can happen when we do work together. So what was the result of that work? What did we accomplish? In fact, what was done for us was literally unprecedented, to do all of that in such a short period of time. And just a number of months later, we were able to apply for an emergency use and assessment listing with the WHO. That was filed in September of 2016 and is under review. And also it was based on these data, and these data were then ultimately published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in March of 2017. And what they in essence show is that all of the healthy volunteers that received the Ebola vaccine showed a humoral and a cellular immunity response, immuno response that was sustained for at least 1 year. So effective at generating an immune response, and that response was sustained for a year. So to sort of bring the lessons that we learned together in one place, what can the private sector actually bring to the table when it comes to these sorts of responses to epidemics and pandemics, particularly in the area of vaccine R&D, but also I think we have to look bigger and broader than vaccine R&D, because The private sector is very heterogeneous. There are many different skills and expertises, and we have to think, I think, a lot bigger about what the private sector can bring to the table beyond just vaccine R&D, as important as vaccine R&D is. We possess a unique capability for rapid scale-up. We are experts in execution. Just to put it plainly, we are very effective at getting things done. We are able to bring intellectual capital to the table, and when necessary, we are able to bring financial capital to the table as well. Outside of R&D, we also have significant capabilities when it comes to technology platforms, manufacturing, logistics, information technology, transportation, finance, et cetera, and that's speaking broadly about the private sector at large. Just an example of what that can look like. In the setting of the Ebola crisis, my company, J&J, took the lead and pulled together a coalition of what is now approximately 18 large international corporations that have dedicated themselves to helping to implement the global health security agenda and to work closely with governments to assess the findings of the joint external evaluations and to sit at the table and work together with those governments to make sure that those post-JEE action plans have private sector capabilities and insights and assistance ultimately with implementation. That organization is called the Private Sector Roundtable for Global Health Security, and in fact we will be represented at the high-level ministerial meeting for the GHSA in Kampala next week, and working to build and strengthen those relationships and partnerships with the GHSA governments to even higher levels than they are right now. So I mentioned that the private sector, when necessary, is able to bring not only intellectual capacity and capability to the table, but also financial resources to the table. But I think it's important to remember what Seth Berkley said and what many others have said as well in similar words. Ebola vaccines have little in the way of commercial markets, so the risks should be shared between governments and the industry. But not only the risks should be shared, but also the risks and the responsibility should be shared. We believe that we share the responsibility with our partners, with the rest of the world, for some of the reasons that I've already outlined. And we feel, however, that in order to make this possible, the financial risks actually do have to be shared. Johnson & Johnson has done it for tuberculosis. We developed the first new drug for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in 40 years with a significant investment, and I think that as a disease of poverty, we would agree that the likelihood of recouping that investment in the traditional way for a pharmaceutical is completely unlikely. We're in the process of doing this for Ebola by developing a vaccine for Ebola that will be available for future outbreaks. We announced in the middle of September that we are developing partnerships now for a vaccine against Zika. In order to do this and to continue to do this effectively, we have to share the risk financially with other partners to make sure that not only us, but other companies can come forward and bring their innovations to the table to make sure that vaccines and drugs are available for diseases of poverty and for emergencies in the future. So what can we achieve through multi-sector collaboration? Convergence of innovation and technologies, coordinated action, reduced duplication and leveraging of strengths, and also, I think very importantly, we can jointly and preemptively address complicated or contentious issues. And there certainly are complicated and contentious issues when it comes to developing vaccines for epidemics and pandemics. Things like regulatory pathways, licensing requirements, incentives and indemnification. Something that I think is a surprise, but even an embarrassment for all of us who work in this space, is that we keep coming back and asking these questions again and again with each successive outbreak, but we, to date, have not always been able to come up with the answers and a path forward. But by sitting at the same table and working together in a multi-sectoral, collaborative way, we should be able to reach those answers. So just to sum up and to conclude, it's important that we create a climate in which we can all work together, a climate of collaboration and trust. I think when it comes to the industry perspective, one of the best expressions of that collaboration of trust is a seat at the table, being able to sit together with our colleagues, be they in government or academia or civil society now, before there's an emergency, so that we can work together to plan and make sure that we're aligned on the sense of urgency and we're aligned on the priorities, and that together we can create a framework for action. So I'll stop there, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's interesting to see that how kind of the similar themes came out in your talk as in the talk by Stefan Kaufmann. And I would say that one of the silver linings of the West Africa Ebola epidemic was that for the first time there was actually research going on during the epidemic, which has many, many challenges, and also that three big pharma companies, besides J&J, as Alan showed, Merck and GSK, all invested, and I think with no realistic expectation that this would provide a return on investment. The question, of course, is how many times can that happen? And so that's why we need to have the mechanisms a la CEPI. The last speaker, and to show that not only men are dealing with vaccines, is by Heidi Larson, who yesterday chaired a session on vaccine apathy. Today, her title is a bit more on the constructive side, the Vaccine Confidence Project, and the importance of building public trust in vaccines. And Heidi works at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Please, Heidi.
Thanks very much. I didn't choose the title for yesterday's session, thank you, but I understand it. Actually, the transition's quite good because, well, trust came up quite a bit in the last presentation, but also I happen to have led the community building, trust building around the J&J Ebola vaccine trial in Sierra Leone. It was a fantastic collaboration, and I have to say that it was a productive relationship, but it was an investment in trust and confidence. The issues of trust and confidence are mentioned a lot, but the level of investment is usually next to nothing. And unfortunately, it's led in the state of the world's vaccine confidence to people not feeling that they're getting enough participation and engagement. Not that you buy it, but that you invest in the time to take with communities to build their relationship. I thought the credo of the last presentation about the responsibility to communities and the world community is core, and that it should happen beyond the specific of a product or an immunization program. We need relationship building. This talk is, I'm going to give you a glimpse of what's going on in the world and why we should, in light of all the fantastic investments and great products in the pipeline and currently available, we have issues in the world with vaccine confidence right now. We need more investment in it, and we need more attention and openness to addressing it. I'll just glance through a few quick slides of some issues in the world. I will start by saying I'm very positive about vaccines. I would not be doing what I'm doing without my strong belief in the power of vaccines. So don't take the next, as they say in TVs and films, you will be seeing some disturbing images. It's not because I'm a negative person. I'm paying attention to this world. I've invested in building a research group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine called the Vaccine Confidence Project. We have a growing group of research collaborators around the world. We are keeping our eyes open, monitoring, listening, and paying attention to a very different but very important aspect of risk mapping. It's in France. It's in Colombia. It's in Denmark. It's in Ireland. It's in Indonesia. It's in the USA and in the White House. It's in Italy. And in all of these cases, like in Italy, it's affecting acceptance of vaccines. It's affecting the outbreak of diseases such as measles. In Berlin itself, the U.S. was focused on the Disney outbreaks. In Germany was having quite large outbreaks of measles, 600 cases in Berlin alone, an 18-month-old child dying. These sentiments have public health impacts. And it's not just about Europe and the US, it's about other countries, developing countries, poor countries. It's not just when you have a luxury of feeling you're not at risk. It's because you don't trust the authorities. It's because there's alternative ways of addressing disease. And it's because people are now connected in the world. And one of the things we're focusing on in our research is not the individual determinants of vaccine acceptance, of which there's a growing amount of research, but there's not enough attention to the links to transnational movements, to the power of social media, to be both positive and to be negative, to spread not only important information, but misinformation. And that's getting a traction at a speed and scope that we need to get ahead of. I don't think we can actually get ahead of it, but we need to at least catch up with it and not wait for crises, particularly in the face of the potential pandemic and epidemic threats. I think the experience around the H1N1, we had appalling global public acceptance of the H1N1 vaccine. I got calls from India saying, can you please send your group to understand why 85% of our health workers in Gujarat state refused this vaccine. We had so little vaccine. We prioritize health workers. They don't want it. Why? Vaccine hesitancy, as I mentioned in the India case, is also among health workers. It's not just about the public, and the public is not ignorant, as I was told by some very feisty women in Kano State in northern Nigeria. What makes us angry is when we hear on the radio that we're questioning vaccines because we're ignorant. We wouldn't be questioning if we were so ignorant. So this isn't an issue about knowledge or not knowledge. It's about sentiment. It's about feeling involved. It's about confidence, not only in the vaccine, but in the provider, in the system, and trust in government. As I mentioned earlier, this is an issue that is not sitting in parts of Europe or the US or in other places, but there's an increasing connection across the world. The original map here was in a paper we published on the links around of sentiment around the HPV vaccine, but I just added a few blue lines, and this map is getting very the one we have on our wall in our offices, you can barely see the continents behind it, but the global transmission of these sentiments. For a while there, because of language, it kind of kept a bit of an island of sentiment. France had its issues with hepatitis B vaccine and MS, and U.S. had thimerosal, and another country had another problem, and Nigeria had their issue. But again and again, we're seeing in YouTubes and social media and other ways. I saw one YouTube the other day that was in Colombia, this revolt against the HPV vaccine, subtitled in English with Japanese voiceover. These things are getting, and Google Translate, as you probably know, are not perfect translators, which add to the confusion of sentiment. This is a growing map. A few years ago, the World Economic Forum, every year they do their global risk report. I find them very valuable. They identified 3 top risks in the world. This is I think it was 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. The first one was the economic situation, which we all know well, was very accurate risk prediction. The second one was digital wildfires, which I think we've seen here. Arab Spring and some various things showed us the power of it, both positively and negatively. But the third domain that they had picked as one of the biggest global risks was human hubris around health. And the fact that people are feeling they know better. They know better than the scientists, they know better than the reality. And the three of them, as I'm seeing, are converging. It's another element of this map that we're following. One of the things that I've been working on this issue for nearly a decade. When I was first trying to bring attention to this issue, I was for a while the global head of UNICEF's immunization communication. I saw this happening in outbreaks around the world, questions and refusals by government, by communities, by individuals, and felt like we needed to pay more attention to it. I wasn't getting a lot of traction, to say the least, either, especially in WHO, and a little bit of understanding in UNICEF, but just we don't have time for that, deal with the problems, deal with getting the vaccines out there. So I decided to leave and set up this research group. And one of the things I realized in my efforts to bring attention to this issue a decade ago was we don't have enough evidence. It's anecdotal. It's only a few people. Focus on the positive majority. And I felt like the only way we would get traction is to start to measure it, monitor, see the impact on vaccine acceptance, see the impacts on outbreaks. And that's the primary thing that we do with sharing with governments and with immunization programs to help them anticipate before there is a crisis. We've developed metrics for it. SAGE, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts at WHO, a few years ago said, we do have a problem. We have more and more countries coming to us. We need an advisory group. I was part of a 10, 12-person advisory group to establish some global monitoring tools. We had already started on this in our group, so we did a lot to give some background data and reviews. Last year, we published a State of the World's Vaccine Confidence Report, and you can see from the shades, the darkest point were the most skeptical. France won the prize, not by a small amount. We didn't have a lot of data on Africa, but we're currently analyzing a study with the same questions in the Sahel region that should be published hopefully by the end of the year. And we will be doing more waves of this to see change over time, and also focusing on doing some subnational analysis. We also had done a few years before a similar global map, but using global media monitoring and doing sentiment analysis. We did human coding of over 10,000 media reports, identifying 33 different causes of concern that we identified, and developed a diagnostic tool to anticipate which of them had a more negative impact. The map is not dissimilar to what we did last year, which was surveys where we knew all the information about the people who were responding to the survey. This was, we had less information about, that's one aspect of media. Social media is, you don't always get the geotagging or know the demographic background. So one of our mantras is you need multiple sources. So when we talk about vaccine confidence, one of the important things is to understand what do we mean by it. And we are called the Vaccine Confidence Project. Sometimes I think we just should be called the Confidence Project, because more and more we're seeing that confidence in vaccines or other health interventions are very tightly tied with confidence in the health provider, the individual, their relationships, that they feel like they're listened to, respected, dignity. More and more people say they're refusing vaccines because they don't feel like they're respected. They think they're brushed off. They feel like they're a number that's being counted. And they miss that rapport. Relationship with the provider, relationship with the system, and with the policymaker. So motive is huge. trust in the motive. And the other big thing that came up again and again was trust in safety and quality of the product. Overwhelmingly, we've done a lot of work with ECDC as well as globally. This type of breakdown, this happened to be in our European analysis, but this is not dissimilar to the research we've done in other parts of the world. Anxiety about side effects, anxiety about safety and risks is a very big thing, and particularly with newer vaccines, that they don't feel like there's enough information. As I mentioned, we see a lot of ties between confidence in the product and confidence in the system. We talk about it a lot as, oh, well, if there was a better health system, we'd get better acceptance. But I really couldn't find data very far, so we did collect some data on this. And in India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and the UK, consistently, the higher level of confidence in the system and the services, the lower the hesitancy around vaccines. Just a couple last points on recommendations is we need to not wait for a crisis. We need ongoing real-time monitoring of what people are thinking. Sentiment around vaccines is about as volatile as political opinion. Don't think a survey you did a few years ago is going to be relevant to what people are feeling or thinking today. There are some what we call slower drivers, marginalization, religious beliefs. There are a few things that are a bit more consistent, but there's a lot of volatile issues popping up that can shut down a program or at least disrupt it quite quickly. As I mentioned, no single metric tells a story. We look at the fast data, we look at the slow data, and we do also talk about what you can do about it outside of the metrics. This is our website and my final slide, vaccineconfidence.org. Every day that map changes, we pick up news pieces around the world which addresses what are some of the emerging issues and points around vaccines. We have ongoing literature that comes up, any new relevant literature, and I write regular commentaries. So I think this is, again, I am very positive, but I think we really need to get awake to the issues. If you can't, we have a mantra, you can't fix a problem you don't understand. Certainly not just with communications. We need real-time evidence, and it's a very important component of preparedness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Thank you for bringing science in a complex issue and metrics. And also this whole area illustrates what Laurie Garrett has been repeating for a while, that the erosion of trust in general, but also in public health and health systems, is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. So we are now ready for a dialogue either among ourselves. Please identify yourself and ask questions. Yes, please. I can hardly see. So there are microphones. There's also one here. Yeah, that's also. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
My name is Hubert Pizarek. I'm a medical student here in Berlin, and my question is towards Dr. Tennenberg. It is very unfortunate what Ms. Larson just presented towards the skepticism for vaccines. What do you think a company like Johnson & Johnson can do to reduce that skepticism and bridge the gap towards people who are misinformed or misled?
Thank you for the question. It's a very important issue, because I think that as vaccine developers, we share the responsibility around making sure that there is sufficient data to demonstrate that a vaccine is safe and that a vaccine is well tolerated, and also working to make sure that that a plan around helping people to understand the data that are out there and to help them to be more accepting of a vaccine is very important. And that's why we partner with experts in the space like Heidi And when it came to the Ebola vaccine clinical trials, we did work closely with Heidi and her group to help to increase the acceptance of the vaccine during the clinical trials in Sierra Leone. Would you like to?
Yeah, Heidi, you want to say maybe some examples?
Yeah, actually, with the clinical approvals and whatever, it took a while, but one thing was that, I mean, for the actual trial to get started, but we took advantage of every part of the process to build the relationship with the community. I'm an anthropologist, and anthropologists are not famous for being quick on their toes with information. So our real effort was to do real-time feedback, quick, rapid assessment, and we developed a relationship with the community and the trial team and the outreach people. And I have to say, if there was an indicator of our success, it was two things. One was just before we did the lottery for who would participate, people were in the mosque praying that their house would be selected, which is rare in a clinical trial. And when the selection was made, we had one person actually move to a cousin's house so he could be part of the trial. So it's anecdotal, but it was very positive. We're still there. We're building it further. We're going into pediatric cohorts. In the absence of an outbreak, we work on immunogenicity.
Yes, next, gentleman from Bangladesh.
Hello, Tasdik from Bangladesh, and right now a student of London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Global Mental Health. My query is to Dr. Heidi. You talked about vaccine hesitancy among health professionals. So do you consider that this hesitancy is the outcome of failure of global public health academicians, or it is a failure of cultural context of different countries? And my second query directed towards Dr. Allen, you talked about shock. When a shock hits the system, it can collapse the whole health system. So already 5 million Rohingyas have hit Bangladesh health systems. So what should we do right now to focus on creating an alternative health systems, or to absorb them with the current existing health systems with limited resources we have? Thank you.
There are some very positive health professionals, but we do see this change. I think what's happening is we need to invest more in supporting health professionals. They are on the front lines facing some of the groups and the questions that I had showed. They feel not adequately supported on this. I have to say they're confronted with a lot of questions. They don't have a lot of time. So I think we need to give more support to them. One of the things we found in our research was that peer support was also important. If they felt that one of their colleagues was a bit wavering, then they started to waver. If they had, so we just need to support them more. And I don't think there's much medical training that actually helps with the issue of dealing with difficult conversations. So I think we need to get that much more into nursing and to medical curriculums.
I hope I understood that second part of your question correctly, but I think you were asking me what we need to do proactively to make sure that we have healthcare systems that are resilient to be able to survive and in fact thrive and continue to provide primary care services, even in the event of an emergency or a crisis. Is that correct? Is that a good summary? So ultimately, something that we believe in as an organization, and I think that probably many others in the room agree with as well, is it's extremely important that we invest in strong, resilient primary healthcare systems in resource-limited settings. And it doesn't mean that those healthcare systems have to look the same as they might look in Europe or in the United States. But right now, in many parts of the world, there is simply a lack of healthcare infrastructure and of trained healthcare practitioners, whether it's neurosurgeons on the extremely highly trained end or simply community healthcare providers who are available to provide basic primary healthcare services, prenatal care, and just to make sure that primary healthcare needs are taken care of. So not only do we need to have a cadre of trained and supported and well-paid healthcare workers, but also protected healthcare workers, since we've had simply too many situations where healthcare workers themselves have become targets in the setting of crisis.
Thank you very much. I think you see there, and then we have a gentleman on the side, please.
Lars Schade, Robert Koch Institute. I have a question to Heidi Larson. A number of European countries just recently enforced mandatory vaccinations. Do you have data or observations? Is it effective or is it rather counterproductive? And what is the impact on the trust you mentioned?
The first image was the reaction in France. So there is a lot of resistance to mandates, and it does fire up some people. But frankly, I think in some cases we need it. In both the case of Italy and France, their introduction of a mandate was in the context of an outbreak, and actually some people dying, and a woman had died in France with measles because of the refusals, and I think that there was a public health motive behind it. There was also an issue raised in the decision about the mandate, is that some of these vaccines, there had been 3 required in France, I think before school was the issue, but in the meanwhile more and more vaccines have been wrapped into one, so you can't really require or mandate a few vaccines when they're administered in the context of a vaccine that can, like a hexavalent or a multiple vaccine. So one of the challenges with although much more administratively and cost-effective to combine vaccines, it does become an issue when someone has, you can't require some without others. So I think in some settings, certainly in the US, having more mandates does increase acceptance, but I think one way to make it more acceptable is to have an opt-out option. Go with the opt-out, not the opt-in.
Thank you. So question, gentleman there, and then Laurie Garrett in the middle.
Robert Sebag, medical doctor from France. I am ashamed that the country of Pasteur is the last one in terms of trust. But perhaps we try to explain. I agree with Heidi Larson when you say the people, they don't believe to the experts, they don't believe to health authorities, they don't believe to the doctor, because after it was a big failure of immunization campaign a few years ago in H1N1 in France, we had some problem with the mediator, with some products, and many campaigns like that, and they don't believe to the expert now. And when you say immunization is one, you hide something, What about aluminium? Now the new topic on immunization in France is aluminium. We had multiple sclerosis with hepatitis B, and I say yesterday to your session, Madame Larson, that they don't believe is not irrational, it's completely emotional, and we don't know how to answer to these people. If we give scientific results, they don't believe us, because they don't believe to health authorities, they don't believe to the doctors, they don't believe to the expert. We have to come back about the credibility of these people. It's a long process, and we have to manage this point.
Yeah, you want to say something? Then
I think it was more of an important comment,
confirming what you said.
Except that I agree, and it will take time.
Yeah, it's like in the Brexit referendum campaign, where one of the protagonists favoring Brexit said, "We are tired of experts," and that and was applauded. So anyway, Laurie, please, here in the middle. Yes, can you?
So
here. Okay, you go then, but then Laurie Garrett. So I asked to give the microphone.
My name is Martin
here.
Mengler. I work with
But
the
there,
agency.
please give the microphone to Laurie Garrett. Okay, and then you go on, please, because we.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry,
You start.
Cutting anyone off.
Yeah.
My name is Martin Mengler. I work for the Agency of Preventive Medicine in Paris. I have a question primarily, I suppose, to Dr. Hatchett. And I was wondering, in your view, do you think that the necessary institutions in your target countries and developing countries are in place to introduce the new vaccines that you're hoping to develop? I'm thinking specifically of independent national technical advisory groups.
Thank you for the question. I think the short answer is it varies. Different countries have different capabilities. We certainly are aware of the weakness and fragility of the clinical trial infrastructure, for example, in many of the countries in Western Africa affected by Lassa. And so for I don't view CEPI's mission as being strictly limited to the technical project of developing a vaccine. I think our vaccines have to go into systems that are functional and that can provide delivery capability. And so one of our roles in SEPI is to also think about those systemic delivery issues and to think about the requirements for testing in regions at risk. It's not necessarily that we, SEPI, will solve that, but we have to identify the partners and establish the networks to advance capacity in the countries at risk. So, yes.
Thanks. I think this is an extremely important question for all types of vaccines. And if we accept that often the first vaccine going through a phase 3 will not be the end of the story, which I'm convinced ours will also not be the end of the story, even if it works, then we need much more sophisticated sites at several places, and that is often missing because what we now want to learn from a vaccine trial in a kind of experimental medicine approach to learn how does the response look like in those who responded in a sense of protection versus those who were not protected, and the RV144 story that is unfolding actually now only over the last years tells us how important that is. So I would second that strongly, that we need better infrastructure in numerous sites to perform the clinical trials at a higher level than just seeing whether it protects or doesn't protect and gives the information for the next generation.
Thank you, Stefan. Really important comments. So we have Laurie Garrett and then gentlemen on that side and one on the other side, and then unfortunately we have to close the discussion. Laurie, please.
Thank you. My question is to Dr. Kaufmann and Dr. Hatchett. Both of you placed great emphasis on the problem that we don't really have good incentive systems for commercial development. We hear a lot of kind of the same sweeping, vague, rhetorical answers every time this issue arises. How do you get them into the marketplace and get real commercial development? Have you given more thought? I mean, how are you going to incentivize tuberculosis vaccine development? How are you going to incentivize for Nipah? Anybody who gets Nipah is desperately poor. How do we get there?
I agree that there is clearly a lack. I would call ourselves perhaps not lucky, but there was a lot of serendipity to find a partner that was interested in developing further from industry side. And I still think it's interesting that this was not one of the big European US players, but one of a developing country. I would like to point out a few things, perhaps that we have to strengthen clearly partnerships like IMI, which was mentioned before, the Innovative Medicine Institute or Institute for Innovative Medicine, where partners from academia and big pharma get together. It's sometimes very difficult. We are in a two project, but somehow it helps at least to mobilize not only money, but also in their actions. And the other one I would like to point out is which I personally, and I'm biased because I'm on their board, is the EDCTP, I think is a success story, the European Developing Country Trial Platform, which is funded with up to €500 million in that case, and which is a platform which has originally been focusing on HIV, malaria, TB, has been broadened to neglected tropical diseases and also includes Ebola now, and there are trials developed also with EDCTP funding. Yes, the answer is we are far from being on a stage which can, we could say it's satisfactory. There are few glimmers of hope, and again, it depends on you on us. Whether the wine glass is half full or empty, I still consider it, and probably you agree on that, it's still half empty. It has been a little bit improved.
All right, thanks for the question. I'll try to be brief. I've been doing this for about 15 years, and I've thought a lot about this question, and I can't claim to have solved it. It's a tough nut to crack. I will just say there are two pieces to the problem. There's the problem of incentivizing the private sector to work on the problems that we want to work on them. Alan, when he put up his what industry can bring to the table, that list, those are not nice to haves. Those are absolutely essential. We cannot do this without private sector partnerships and engagement. And I think we've actually solved the issue of incentivizing industry, at least within the U.S. government. I mean, we were trying to address market failures for diseases that essentially didn't exist, like anthrax, like smallpox. And for years, we beat our head against the wall and didn't necessarily succeed. By putting in place carefully crafted push incentives, funding R&D contracts, pull incentives, procurement contracts, providing technical support, providing privileged access to regulators, we actually were able to create a system which over time delivered 23 licensed, cleared, or approved products for products that had no commercial market. So we can actually figure out, we can address the getting industry to the table piece. The problem that we have never really been able to solve in the US government or in the global health space is producing sustainable solutions. And every success creates a tail unless you address this, unless you find a commercial market. And if you can't find a commercial market, then your success, you have to assume responsibility for the long tail of sustainability, and that's hard.
These will be the two last questions, and then we'll have lunch. Yes, please, go ahead, gentlemen.
I'm Kwame Nindakwa.
Can you stand up, and then we can see you? Thank you.
I'm Kwame Nindakwa, a medical student from Ukraine. I want to know about, for me, I care about the clinical picture of vaccines, and I want to know if there are antidotes which are produced for each new vaccines that come up, because I think people are afraid to take the vaccines because they are afraid to get hypersensitive to the vaccines. So I want to know if there are antidotes produced for each new vaccine, or if there's any general antidote for, or any measures towards hypersensitivity and hyperactivity of the person towards the vaccines. Thank you.
You understand the question?
I think the question was whether there were antidotes for the side effects or reactions that vaccines cause. And so if you're nodding, so I think I got the question right. So I'm going to hand the microphone to Alan to let him answer that.
Thank you. So you're asking a very, very broad question. And it's hard to answer it specifically because we're not talking specifically about an individual vaccine. I think the first thing you have to determine is what side effect or reaction are we talking about. I think that's the first thing to determine which vaccine are we talking about. So are there ways to address an adverse reaction that comes from either a vaccine or an antibiotic or an over-the-counter medication? Yes, there can be, depending upon which type of reaction that we're talking about. So I don't know if I can answer the question any more specifically than that, because it's a sort of a broad and generalized question to begin with. You know, I think that when it comes to vaccines and adverse reactions related to the vaccines, what we have to separate between are the real biological, physical reactions that do take place when either a vaccine or a pill, a medication is taken. Typically, they're pretty quantifiable. We have a decent understanding of what they might be. And we have to separate that out from some of the what's not real, some of the hype or some of the concerns or some of the rumors that come out. And I think that if we can find a way to sort of be more transparent about what's real and what should be expected and what you can expect. Yes, there are times when you can't anticipate everything, but separate that out from the myths that I think cause a lot of concern and fear where there need not be, then maybe we'd be in a somewhat better place when it comes to vaccine acceptance.
And
last but not least, yes, please.
Boulaye from National Institute of Research in Public Health in Mauritania. I want to ask about two vaccines, MERS and Rift fever. What stage are these vaccines, or only these are projects? And how to associate countries which are interested by this disease? Thank you very much.
Just to repeat the question and make sure that we heard it correctly. I think you were asking about the status of MERS vaccines as well as the status of vaccines for Rift Valley fever. And I will say that there are a number of MERS vaccines that are under development. We've seen many of them were submitted for potential funding by CEPI. There is one candidate that at least one candidate that I'm aware of that actually has already entered phase 1 clinical trials. That's a vaccine supported by a company called Inovio in the US. And it's receiving support from IVI in South Korea. So that's quite exciting. I actually can't speak to the portfolio or to the status of the Rift Valley fever. I'll have to get back to you on that. Happy to. And I know we've looked at it, but I just don't have the data at my fingertips.
Thank you very much to the speakers, to the audience. I mean, I thought this was a very enlightening and also sometimes sobering, session. It's exciting times for the vaccine field in the sense that we've got highly effective vaccines that have saved millions of lives, literally. And paradoxically, now that we have more and more tools, that the confidence, including in very educated and wealthy people, is going down. That is a very disturbing development. But also, I think, like the work that Stefan presented shows how long it takes to develop a vaccine. It's not so easy, and the science, but then also the manufacturing, the distribution, and that we now have better mechanisms than ever before, both on the science, but also in terms of the partnerships, the how to do it, and that is, I think, is encouraging. So let's make sure that this kind of research continues to be supported, because there are really new areas in terms of science, but also I would say the politics and the delivery that can make a huge difference in people's lives. So thanks again and bon appétit. Right.